a huge thank you to our excellent guest speakers today. It's really brilliant that you can share your time with us, and I think it's going to be a really exciting mix of talks and discussions about this ocean, climate and biodiversity nexus. And our guests are all looking at cutting edge research or are working on the front line of managing these delicate marine systems in a rapidly changing world. I've invited them specifically because they work across multiple ecosystems and across disciplines, which should make it a really nice discussion at the end. And it's going to be a fairly whistle-stop ride, looking at marine and coastal systems ranging from right down in the deep sea and then up into the skies and the coasts on land. And it's from work here in the UK, spreading out past the Mediterranean and over to the Western Indian Ocean. And so I just wanted to start the session just briefly trying to kind of set the scene for today's talks. And I think this quote by John Muir puts it quite nicely. In essence, the world is a very complex place. And the more we research how these sort of natural systems work, the more we appreciate that it's far more complex and intricately connected than we could have imagined. Or as Rachel Carson put it succinctly, in nature, nothing exists alone. And so this nature-climate nexus in this context is kind of the relationship between climate change and biodiversity, including all the synergies and trade-offs between the two in terms of their function, management, and benefits. And in some ways, it's quite well understood that there are these inherent links and complexities between the systems, and that these links actually were explicit in the original three Rio Conventions on climate, biodiversity, and desertification. But studying and managing these systems holistically is really hard, and COPs like this one that we're attending virtually often fall into these kind of siloed discussions or incoherent actions between governments and countries in terms of how they act on climate. And today's the last day of climate COP29 in Baku, and it's the virtual setting for today. And some really good work has been done at the recent biodiversity COP that happened last month, making commitments on this link between nature and climate. And some progress has happened at this climate COP on areas such as highlighting how ecosystem services are of great use and having this specific ocean climate dialogue session in between COPs since 2021, yeah. And so at the center of all of these ideas, there's always people. And I like to frame these kind of interconnections of the nexus with the concept of Kate Roas donut economics. And if you've not heard of this concept, it describes that we all live within these essential boundaries, and the ecological ceiling or planetary boundaries are made up of these multiple essential environmental components, which if we overshoot them, it will lead to this safe and just space for humanity, this area in green, the donut in the middle, being impacted. Similarly, if there's a shortfall in the social foundations at the bottom, people will again be impacted. And so stable climate, biodiversity, and oceans are all part of these planetary boundaries, but don't exist as independent issues. And unfortunately, managing the deterioration of each are considered these wicked problems, as they all have these unique challenges, which are all complex and which have unclear, usually non-linear connections. So conservation is quite tricky. And so the oceans are sometimes termed the great connector. We know that humans are often really heavily reliant on marine ecosystems, and ocean habitats are crucial for conservation and hugely undervalued systems. And people are reliant on these systems and their services to various degrees throughout the world. And approximately 1 billion people are directly reliant on the oceans and the services they provide. And that reliance is kind of consistent, but yeah, perhaps more reliant in these areas in the global south, but throughout the world. And critically, oceans have absorbed around 90% of the excess heat by greenhouse gas and around 25% of carbon dioxide emissions. So they're crucially important in this discussion. And with every increase in temperature, with every marginal increase, we're increasing the risk to these systems, both on land and in the sea. And so this is from the IPCC latest report, just showing these modeled trajectories where we have very low emissions up to very high. And these correlate to different temperature ranges. And so at the lowest temperature range, even now we're getting these impacts on unique and threatened ecosystems such as coral reefs. We're getting increases in strength and frequency of weather events, so storms, hurricanes, things like that. The distribution of events, of impacts is increasing. So there's less certainty in where these are going to happen, but we know that with every increment in temperature, we're going to get more and more severe versions of these. We know that on aggregate, these impacts are going to start interacting and additively accumulating. And that's going to impact people as well as how much finance is needed to fix these issues. And we know that these large important events like extinctions or tipping points are also increasingly likely at these higher temperatures. And so for marine ecosystems specifically, these different systems are very sensitive to these changes, particularly areas like coral reefs, where even now at the lower temperatures we're getting severe impacts. But we know at higher temperatures, these impacts are going to be even more pronounced. And that's similar for kelp forests and increasingly for seagrass and other marine habitats. And at the moment, we're at 1.3, just to sense check where we are on that. And that 1.3 is a central average, so we're starting to dip into these higher amounts. And we know that based on an optimistic scenario where all our agreements from these COPs are met, we're going to perhaps go to around 1.9, give or take. But if it's just words and these policies aren't enacted, we're going to head up on the current trajectory to these higher temperatures around 3+. And so this idea of bringing biodiversity into the climate debate through nature-based solutions is key. And it's perhaps the biggest overlap in these three conventions. This idea of using nature to battle climate and use these solutions from these services. And it's perhaps debatable that there's no viable solution to climate change without investment in these nature-based solutions and the people that manage them. And so this figure on the left is just showing these different trajectories and how the introduction of nature-based solutions in these systems can reduce the peak and also bring down the temperature at a faster rate. So if implemented on a global scale, they can be really, really useful in this fight against climate change. And so to summarize, nature and climate are really tightly interconnected, and we've discussed some of the ways that happens. And so that can be through direct climate impacts, so perhaps noticeably in areas where we're seeing mass bleaching events due to increases in temperature, and also through destruction of habitats which emit gases from their destruction, so perhaps logging of forests. We know that carbon is stored within these various sources and sinks within nature, and that carbon flows through these systems in the global carbon cycle. And so perhaps the biggest talking point around today might be how we might use these solutions in nature for climate mitigation to try and lessen the impact of climate, and how we might use them to adapt into the future to make more resilient landscapes for these changing times. And connected to all these ideas are, again, how we might use technology to accelerate that adaptation, how we might scale up these conservation approaches from local to a global scale, how that might be possible, how we bring in all the finance necessary for these works, and how we direct that to local people working on the ground, and how we make this approach equitable and fair. And so really briefly, I just wanted to touch on some of the work Fauna and Flora does, because this is really pivotal to the work we do, preserving nature. And so just to use a few examples from mangroves, which we're sort of touching on most marine habitats, I think, in these discussions from the excellent panel guests today, but we seem to have missed mangroves, so I'm just going to use them as a study focus. And so in Nicaragua, we're working with communities there to help reforest areas of mangroves that have been lost. And so that's directly improving that habitat specifically, but it's also bringing back that habitat for these species that are again impacted by these climate impacts, such as the fisheries and the sea turtles that live within the roots. So there's multiple ecosystem services to these systems, and they're perhaps one of our best allies in the fighting climate change. So we know they store huge amounts of carbon. In Cambodia, we've been looking at carbon storage within these mangroves and their adjacent seagrass beds. And we know that these systems are really tightly connected. And other speakers will be talking about these connections later on as well. And so it's a really important reminder that you can't act on a system alone. You have to think about it a little bit more holistically and look at how those connections sit together. In Kenya, we're looking at a more of a policy approach, so working with local communities there and our partners and staff on the ground to work with government to build up capacity on nature-based solutions and integrate it better within their nationally determined contributions to the Paris Accord about how we bring in mangroves and seagrass within those ideas. And in Tanzania, again, we're working with communities to help protect their current mangrove systems as well as restore where needed to adapt to the changes that we're expecting into the future. And so that's just a really brief overview of some of the ways you might think about these interconnections. And so now on to our amazing guests. And so I'll work through them, starting with Anna Quiros. And so Anna, if you just start preparing your slides, I'll stop sharing and I can introduce you. And so Professor Anna Quiros is a principal investigator of marine climate change ecology at Plymouth Marine Labs. And she's also an honorary professor at University of Exeter. And she's a leading expert in seaweed blue carbon, leading and advising on research programs around the world, seeking to protect oceanic carbon towards climate change mitigation. And Anna's team has produced the first field estimates of seafloor sequestration of seaweed carbon in the wild. So she works actively at the Science Policy Interface. And so Anna, it's a pleasure. Over to you.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. Fingers crossed everything works on the technology side. Indeed, so I'll be talking a little bit about kelp carbon and how to protect carbon in the ocean in general and the climate change. So starting with kelp habitats, I think quite an iconic species. We know that they're keystone species in the ocean. They protect and serve as habitats to a large number of species. So they protect marine biodiversity. They host also nursing grounds for species of high commercial value. And in addition to that, they perform a number of other ecosystem services that are thought to be worth more than $500 billion a year, particularly by serving that nursery habitat, fisheries, enhancing their productivity, but also being important recyclers of nutrients in the ocean, providing bioremediation in areas of high nutrient loading, but also importantly through their effects on the global carbon cycle. And so kelp are thought to absorb through their natural primary productivity about 1.3 petagrams of carbon per year. So that's a substantial number. And a lot of that carbon does not stay in the kelp. So kelp frequently have or they do have these seasonal cycles of biomass. And so a lot of that carbon actually ends up as detritus in the ocean and as dissolved and particulate forms in the ocean. So one of them being dissolved organic carbon, so that if you've held kelp in your hands, you will have felt how gelatinous it feels, how jelly-like it feels, and that's the dissolved organic carbon. That's a really important store in the ocean. It also produces alkalinity, so a long-term inorganic form of carbon in the ocean. But importantly, it produces this detritus, so the effect of waves and temperature leads to this shedding of material through the seasonal cycle, through the seasons. And some of that, or a lot of that, might end up on the seafloor. So a lot of our work is about trying to understand how can we protect this particularly important transfer of inorganic carbon from the atmosphere into the ocean and its permanence in these long-term stores like the alkalinity store in the ocean and the seafloor. And because of these reasons, there's been a lot of interest in both enhancing the conservation mechanisms for kelp carbon in the wild, so for wild populations, as well as for the farming of kelp. And both of these have really captured the public conscious in recent years. And so there's a huge amount of work ongoing in the world trying to develop these approaches in a safe and sustainable way. Now, the difference between kelp and seaweed carbon in general and the more traditional habitats that we tend to protect in the ocean for carbon conservation, so particularly our wetlands, there on the left, the main difference is that for wetlands, for mangroves, seagrass, and salt marsh, all of the carbon sequestration happens in one place. So these plants take the inorganic carbon from the ocean, from the atmosphere, into the living biomass, and that biomass eventually degrades and falls into the seabed, in and around the plant, which then can be protected into the long term. Now, with kelp and seaweed, it's quite different. While the plant sequesters this inorganic carbon, the CO2 from seawater into its living biomass, that detritus and that material then flows away from where the kelp lives around our rocky shores and into the open ocean. And so protecting kelp carbon in general would lead or necessitate mechanisms that protect the source populations through MPAs in our coastal areas, as well as those yet unknown areas of the ocean that might be the particular sinks for that carbon. So we need to think about a different approach to marine protected area design when we think about protecting kelp carbon. So we have quite an active group here in PML. So we have quite a large team working on these issues, combining ecologists and modelers and Earth observation colleagues, as well as people with our robotics. And our mission is really to identify the location of those long-term sinks for that kelp carbon to inform the design of marine protected areas, to enhance the protection of these sites in the ocean so that they continue to serve this service that they've been doing for us for millions of years. So the first thing to do when we want to identify the sinks for that carbon is first we have to understand how fractions of seaweed, how that seaweed detritus is propagated through the ocean. So what are the physical properties of that sinking kelp detritus? And we use that information to set up these physical models for the ocean that then simulate how the wind and waves and currents then propagate those particles away from the shore, away from the kelp and into the open regions of the ocean and indeed into the deep ocean. And with these types of studies, we can start then to identify these sinks and try to inform, and we are working with policymakers, particularly here in the UK, on the development of these approaches to better protect these connected areas between the open ocean and particularly the deep ocean and our coasts, where these vital populations of kelp live. The second part of that is that we need to actually be quite sure that those are the sites where the kelp is staying. So we use approaches like environmental DNA studies that allow us to look at these areas of the sediment and be quite sure that the material we're finding there comes from a particular source population of kelp on the shore. And we're doing that work, for example, in Orkney Islands here in the in the northeast of the UK in Scotland. And then we use another biotracing technique, so carbon and nitrogen stable isotope modeling, which allows us to understand how much of the carbon on the seafloor actually came from seaweed, as opposed to the other sources of carbon in the ocean, like the phyto and the zooplankton. And that, combined with measurements of the processes that actually lead to the accumulation of that carbon on the seafloor and its burial through work that we do out in the ocean on ships, as well as in the lab, we can then have this quite important information that allows us very robustly to link the shore to the seafloor so we can better protect these habitats. And through these types of studies, combining this variety of techniques, we are now we are starting to understand the global value of kelp in its contribution to the global ocean carbon sink. So using similar methods in a study recently led by my colleague, Karen Philby-Dexter, we estimated that perhaps 3 or 4% of the total ocean carbon sink currently derives from particulate detritus from kelp exported from the shores and into the deep ocean beyond 200 meters of depth, which in itself
Accessibility shortcuts.
Pardon?
Use the tab key to navigate and press.
Okay. And so whilst these processes make a great contribution to the global ocean carbon sink, they are also sensitive to climate change. And because of this, we also need to think about climate smart approaches for their conservation, both of the sources and the sinks of this carbon. So for example, work we've done recently in Europe has shown that the survival rate of sugar kelp, a species with high importance in European waters in terms of both wild populations as well as farmed kelp, their survival is predicted to decline sharply, particularly under higher emissions in many parts of Southern Europe, and perhaps even in Northern Europe in the more sensitive climate models. And with similar work as this that we've done, for example, in Tanzania, we can advise, for example, on conservation strategies, on climate resilience strategies for the conservation of these populations, but as well as working with the local sea farming activities, which, for example, in Tanzania are an activity with high important social value. Now, the processes on the seabed that lead to the accumulation and the capture of that carbon into the seafloor away from the atmosphere for that long period, which hopefully has that positive effect on climate change regulation, is in itself also sensitive to climate change. So recent studies we've done, for example, looking at the effect of hypoxia and ocean acidification, which are related or are climate change pressures on the marine environment, we've shown that they strongly modify those processes leading to the capture of that carbon. And so we need to bear all of this in mind when we're trying to inform on the design of protected areas for these systems so that we can be sure that they are indeed effective into the future. And so, for example, work we're doing in the UK, we've been using ecosystem modeling to look at changes in the seabed carbon sequestration potential and how these are affected by climate change into the end of the century. And we found that there are indeed areas of the seafloor that are quite resilient for their ability to sequester carbon, and some of them are more sensitive. And by mapping them to the areas that are currently holding important carbon stores and thinking about the future and and the design of our protected areas, we can then think about placing new protected areas in areas that are indeed producing climate resilient carbon sequestration. So indeed, these habitats are connected not just at the shore, but also they're connected to the open ocean and the seafloor, and their conservation is important if we need to think about nature-based solutions for climate regulation. But it's important that we think that these processes are also sensitive to climate change and that we take climate smart approaches to the way that we design these conservation mechanisms. If you're interested in any of this work, please reach out. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was a fascinating talk. And it's such an interesting and cutting edge area of science. I know those questions have been quite long standing within the blue carbon community about, essentially where the carbon goes and that kind of detailed information. And I think it's also a great example of working with industry. I know you couldn't show your video before, but it's working directly with Talisker whiskey as well, I think, which I think is a really brilliant collaboration, not least because it's a really great whiskey. But yeah, I think it's so useful to bring in industry within these sort of collaborations to do that. Okay, and so I think if we wait for questions to the end and carry on through the list, next up is Gizem Akdogan from AKD, or the Mediterranean Conservation Society. So Gizem, if you can prepare your slides. Gizem's been working as General Secretary at the Mediterranean Conservation Society based in Izmir in Turkey since 2021. She's a long-standing partner of Fauna and Flora. We've been working together there for a number of years. Gizem's had a background in sociology and a master's degree in social entrepreneurship and local government at the Department of Urban Policy Planning and Local Governments at Middle East Technical University. And she's going to be talking about her work in Turkey, working on invasive species and the changes in temperature there. So Gizem, over to you.
Thank you, Daniel. Can you see my screen now?
I can't see it just at the moment.
Just to be sure.
Not yet. If you try sharing again.
Just a minute. I guess now it works.
Yes, that's perfect.
Thank you for the confirmation. Good afternoon, everyone. And today I will be presenting on tropicalization in the Mediterranean, its impacts, and how we are navigating these challenges to build resilient ecosystems and the communities. But before diving into the presentation, I want to take a moment to thank Fauna and Flora for their kind invitation to share our work here. I would like to say that it's truly a privilege to be part of this gathering, and it's an honor to exchange ideas with such distinguished professionals and practitioners. Now we can dive into our story in the Mediterranean. First, let me briefly introduce my organization by addressing these three fundamental questions: who we are, where we work, and what we do. The Mediterranean Conservation Society, or AKD, was established in 2012 as a national non-governmental organization. Our vision is to create a Mediterranean ecosystem where all living beings coexist in harmony and balance. To achieve this, we develop and implement science-based projects to conserve the biodiversity, ecosystem, and the cultural heritage of the Mediterranean. And to achieve, as I said, to achieve this, we are developing those science-based projects, and we are focusing on several special environmental protection areas in Turkey, including Gökova Bay, Fethiye, Göcek, and Datça Bozburun, where we have dedicated staff and offices on the ground. In other areas, we are doing scientific monitoring and preparation or the implementation of management plans of those marine protected areas. And one of our key initiatives is the Marine Ranger System, a pioneering program in Turkey designed to enhance the protection of marine protected areas by monitoring and reporting illegal activities such as fishing violations in no-fishing zones. And our work also focuses on protecting endangered species like the Mediterranean monk seal and sandbar shark. By addressing threats and monitoring and restoring their habitats, we aim to ensure their survival. The Mediterranean faces significant climate challenges. To respond to those challenges, we run climate change monitoring programs, including seawater temperature change and pH change studies, and assessment of Posidonia oceanica meadows, which are endemic to the Mediterranean Sea and a vital habitat for carbon sinks, which also should guide our climate adaptation strategies. And another key initiative is our new fish program, which addresses the rise of invasive species due to those climate challenges. And I will share more details about this new fish program in the upcoming slides. As I said previously, the Mediterranean faces critical climate threats, including sea warming, rising sea levels, and invasive species. And while sea levels are rising by 4 millimeters annually, the seawater, warming seawaters allow tropical species to come towards our waters, disrupting ecosystems and local livelihoods. So to address these challenges, our seawater temperature monitoring program provides essential data to assess those changes and develop effective mitigation strategies. And now you can see from the graphs, we have been closely monitoring seawater temperatures since 2015, using data loggers placed every 5 meters from the surface to a depth of 40 meters. We have collected daily data in Gökova Bay, and since 2020 in Fethiye, Göcek, Kaş, Gökova, and Datça Bozburun marine areas, we are collecting those daily seawater temperature data. In 2023, as you can see in the graph on the right side of the screen, we observed significant warming. The thermocline, which was around 25 meters in 2022, shifted below 30 meters. And during August and September 2023, temperatures between 27 degrees and 29 degrees were recorded at the depths of up to 30 meters. And more concerningly, in October 2023, temperatures of 26 degrees were recorded as deep as 40 meters, which means an increase of 3 to 4 degrees compared to the previous year, October 2022. And we will see what will happen by the end of this year. And what does the increase in seawater temperature mean? Actually, it means that native sponge and coralline species suffer from severe heat stress, but also it indicates that invasive and alien species are increasing their impact in deep waters. Now let's take a look at this photo. It was taken in Kaş in 2015 when a small-scale fisher returned to the shore. Actually, this picture, this photo, and his catch tells a striking story. All the fish you can see on the screen are invasive species, except for one. Rabbitfish, redcoat, and lionfish dominate this net, while a single native species is a reminder of the dramatic changes happening in our waters due to seawater temperature change. And at that time, I would like to remind that the redcoat and lionfish had no market value in our coast. So this net leaving the fisher with no economic return. To address these challenges posed by the invasive species, we launched the NIFISH program, as I previously mentioned, in 2015, starting with Randall's threatened sea bream, Nemipterus randalli in Gökova Bay. With this program, we aim to support ecosystem restoration by reducing pressure on native species while creating economic opportunities for small-scale fishers. To achieve this, we established a trading company in 2020 to purchase and sell only the invasive alien species. We conducted communication campaigns targeting different audiences, such as fishers, restaurant owners, chefs, and consumers, to raise awareness about these edible invasive species. And we held many tasting events in different cities, like in the whole coast of the Mediterranean, Turkish Mediterranean coast. And these tasting events help us to reach a wider audience, while we also held meetings with retail companies to bring these species to the market. We also conducted a study in collaboration with universities to specialize a fishing gear for targeting only those non-indigenous species. And also in this summer, we started to tag lionfish first in the Mediterranean to understand its behavior in the winter season. Additionally, I can say that we did consumer surveys and update our communication strategy to encourage this non-indigenous species consumption. And with this program, this ecosystem restoration program, what we have achieved this far. Actually, this program is a story of turning a challenge into an opportunity. Over the past years, we have removed 18 tons of invasive species from the ecosystem by purchasing them directly from small-scale fishers. And I can proudly say that we collaborate with 9 small-scale fisheries cooperatives in this program. And through our campaign, we received 408 orders from restaurants. So those restaurants put these species into their menus, so people can order and consume those species. And with those campaigns, we reached tens of thousands of people through those restaurants, our tasting events, tasting festivals, and seminars to the fishers, and our social media campaigns and the posts and everything. So this case shows that the power of collaboration and awareness in addressing ecological challenges while supporting the local communities. And I would like to conclude my presentation by emphasizing the critical importance of highly protected marine areas. As you can see in the table, our results show that invasive species biomass is 15% lower in no fishing zones when you compare to the unprotected areas. And also the second table on the screen shows that in 2027, 30% of the catch will be invasive species in our waters. And additionally, I would like to add that fish count data reveal that the increase of non-indigenous species is significantly slower within marine protected areas, which proves those areas' effectiveness in resilience. And I believe these findings should remind us that protecting our marine ecosystem is not just an environmental necessity. It's a crucial step towards securing a sustainable future for both nature and the people to build resilient ecosystems and resilient communities to those challenges. And thank you for your attention. I guess I use my time very efficiently, and I'm happy to answer any questions at the end of this session. And you can follow our work in our social media accounts on the screen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, because yeah, it's really fascinating work and seems to be coming along successfully in Turkey. So yeah, it's a really nice example of how you can use innovative solutions to these very tricky concepts of new invasive species within a marine environment. So the next speaker today is Dr. Ruth Dunn. So Ruth, if you can prepare your slides. So Dr. Ruth Dunn is a senior research associate at Lancaster University and Heriot-Watt University. Ruth is a marine ecologist with expertise in seabird movement and energetics, and she investigates the influence of marine predators on the ecosystems they inhabit and move through. Her recent research has involved trying to advance our understanding of the impacts of island restoration on tropical seabirds, their nutrient flows, and the effects on coral reef ecology, which she's going to talk about now. So thanks, Ruth. Over to you.
Nice, thank you so much. Yeah, it's really great to be participating in this event. And yeah, as Dan has just said, I'm mostly going to be talking about work today that I've done at Lancaster University within the team of Professor Nick Graham alongside Dr. Casey Beckwith. And most of this work has been funded by the Bertarelli Foundation as part of their program of marine science. So just to say thanks to those people for supporting us with this. So a lot of the work that we've been doing recently has been focused within the tropical, Indian and Pacific Oceans. And we've been working in some really remote locations and marine reserves, mostly focused around this habitat that I've got a photo of here. So atoll islands. And atoll islands are recently formed low-lying islands, so they're generally less than 3 meters in elevation. And they're these little sandy islands that rest on top of coral reef structures. So you can see in this photo, we've got this little tropical island resting nicely on top of a coral reef. And when we're on the islands, a lot of them look like this, and they're incredible places to go and visit. So there are birds just filling the air, flying all around your head, nesting in the trees around the coastlines of these islands. And so just, yeah, the sight of the birds, the sounds of them calling, and also the smell of them and of the guano they're producing really does fill the air in these locations. But there are other islands within these regions that look like this. So they're similar in terms of where they're located, in terms of their size and in their geomorphology as well to the previous island that I just showed you. But the difference here is that they have invasive black rats and also abandoned coconut palm plantation forests. And rats are actually present on 90% of the world's islands, and they have decimated seabird populations in lots of these locations, leading to these quiet, scent-free islands, I guess. But on islands where there are seabirds, we've been more recently looking into the ecology of these birds and finding that they forage out within the pelagic ocean, sometimes hundreds of kilometers away from their island colonies. So I've got a map here which shows the central islands where these birds breed, and then these big looping trips that they go on as they go out to sea. And these blobs as well that I've got pictured along the way are where the birds actually dive and forage for fish before then returning back to their breeding colonies. And this year I kind of wangled this video in here because I think it's so cool that we put video loggers on the backs of these birds for the first time. So we're able to see what the birds are seeing whilst they're out at sea. So this video is from the back of a red-footed booby, and you can see it's foraging way out at sea. There's no sign of land, scanning the ocean there. And that there is a little flock of flying fish. And this bird goes in and catches one within its beak. So yeah, this was really exciting for us to see, but kind of in this context tells us that these birds are going out to sea and they're catching these really nutritious pelagic fish. And they're then again returning to the island colonies with the fish to feed their chicks or also to self-provision. And they're depositing this really nutrient-rich guano, which because of the pelagic prey that they're catching is really high in phosphorus and nitrogen. And these birds we've found are bringing back thousands of tons of guano per year, and so are supplying these islands with tons of limited nutrients every year as well, so this nitrogen and phosphorus. So what does all of this mean for the coral reef habitats adjacent to these islands? Well, this was the question that my PI, Nick Graham, had back in 2018, and he went out and gathered samples from the islands and then from the reef systems around them. So he gathered samples of soil and leaves from the islands, also sponge, macroalgae, turf algae, and fish, and did some stable isotope analyses of these samples in order to look at their nutrient concentrations. So on the y-axis in these figures, we've got delta 15N, so the proportion or a kind of a metric of the nitrogen that was found in these different samples. And we found that around islands where there were no rats and where there were high populations of seabirds, there are higher values of nitrogen than around islands where there were rats. And this was true from the soil and leaf samples collected from the islands, as well as within the sponges and the macroalgae samples collected from the reef flats. And we also saw that this seabird influence extended to the reef crest and was higher also within the turf algae and the fish that were collected from here. So we found that this seabird signal extends across these habitats, but what does this actually mean for the ecology and the physiology of these habitats? So first of all, we found that corals around islands with seabirds grow much more quickly than those where there are rats present. So this is work led by Dr. Katie Benquit, and she went out to the field and popped little tags around little small acropora corals, and then continued to watch them and revisit them every few years. And you can see that around islands where there are birds, these corals are really, really large, whereas around islands where there are rats and there's less of these seabird nutrients entering the system, the corals are kind of quite puny in comparison. And this is what the data looks like when we've plotted it. So we've got seabird nutrients on the x-axis, scaling from low seabird nutrients to high seabird nutrients. And then we've got coral growth rates on the y-axis. And you can see that where there are low seabird nutrients, the corals are growing much more slowly. When there are high seabird nutrients, and they're growing actually up to twice as fast. So yeah, this was an amazing relationship we were really impressed by. And at a time when corals are increasingly threatened by more regular bleaching events, so these marine heat waves that cause mass die-offs within corals, we wondered what this might mean. And so we found that we investigated, therefore, coral recovery following a bleaching event. And we did this around islands where there are rats, as well as islands where there were seabirds. And we found that when rats were present, coral recovery after a bleaching event took almost 5 years. So on the y-axis here, we've got the recovery of acropora, this type of coral, its cover. And you can see that it kind of plateaus out back at 100% after 5 years. However, around islands where there are seabirds, we can see that the rate of recovery is happening much more quickly, and the corals are recovering in less than 4 years after a bleaching event. And this is actually 10 months faster than nearby islands where there are rats present. And this rate of recovery is actually really fast, and therefore kind of provides some hope for the influence of these nature-based solutions for coral recovery and resilience to coral bleaching events going forward. So we then also investigated parrotfish, and we found that they were also growing faster around islands where there were seabirds present, as opposed to islands where there were rats. So you can see this growth curve here in blue is above the red one where there are rats present. And parrotfish were actually going up to 35% faster around islands where there were seabirds versus those with rats. And they also reach larger maximum sizes. So you can see that around islands where there are seabirds, the mean body size for these parrotfish is actually 16% larger than parrotfish from around islands where there are rats. And these increased demographic rates, so the faster growth rates and the larger maximum sizes, lead to increased reef fish biomass, increased productivity, and increased species richness. And this is true not just for the parrotfish, but across a range of different dietary guilds. So fish that eat corals, planktivores, invertivores, those that have mixed diets, those that eat other fish, and those that eat plants. You can see that there's this positive effect size. So the biomass is higher around islands with birds as opposed to islands with rats. And as well as this being great in terms of species richness and biomass and things, these fish also have their own really important functional roles within coral reef ecosystems. And so thinking again about this parrotfish, these parrotfish are really vital within coral reef ecosystems for the functions that they perform, such as their grazing and their bioerosion. So they range around reefs, grazing on turf algae that's beginning to grow, and they chomp it back down and keep these ecosystems as coral reef ecosystems. And they're also involved in bioerosion, so again, chomping down on coral reefs and producing sediment. And these plots here show the amount of ecosystem function that's currently occurring on islands where there are rats, but also that which is predicted to occur if rats are eradicated and we engage in these different levels of habitat restoration. So getting rid of those coconut palm plantations that I mentioned and restoring them to these different native vegetation cover scenarios instead. And we predicted that this parrotfish grazing functionality and bioerosion as well would both increase if rats were eradicated and native vegetation was restored. And with it, seabird populations as well, and these seabird nutrients. And so in terms of zooming out a little bit and looking at this on a global scale, the number of invasive species eradications is currently increasing. We can see that multiple invasive taxa are being eradicated, and eradications are also happening across a number of different ecosystems as well. And we think that this is really good news in terms of nature-based solutions and restoring these systems and seabirds and the knock-on influences of these species. And the UN declared 2021 to 2030 the decade of ecosystem restoration, and their aim here was to prevent, halt, and reverse the degradation of ecosystems on every continent and every ocean. So we think that to meet this aim, these eradications should really be a priority. And I think that the research that we're doing within our group, we're kind of hoping that therefore this can, feed into policy, and that the result will be restored ecosystems, including restored seabird populations, nutrient flows, and then knock-on benefits for adjacent ecosystems like coral reefs as well. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Ruth. I always think this is just such a brilliant example of how things interact in so many different ways, and it's such a nice holistic study that illustrates it so well. And it is such a stark difference between the islands as well. I think the difference in the seabirds, the life around it, and then seeing all these new and unexpected ways that it's interlinked is really fascinating. And so finally, today we've got Dr. David Abura speaking, again on Western Indian Ocean corals. So David, if you can prepare your slides. Dr. David Abura is Director of Cordio East Africa and Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. David's primary research over the last 30 years has been on coral reef resilience, biogeography and climate change impacts. And his interests are now turning towards sustainability science, pivoting around coastal African and societal needs and priorities. David works from local to global scales through fostering innovative action to promote sustainability. And David's been awarded Kenya's national honour, the Moran of the Burning Spear in 2021, and Coral Reefs Conservation Award from ICRS in 2022. So it's a real pleasure to have you here, David, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Dan. I hope you can hear me well enough and that my slides are showing properly. So thanks. It's great to hear some of the previous presentations, and fortunately there's some nice connections with mine. And what I'll try and do is, with a broader sort of perspective that I have now coming out of coral reef science into IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, I'll try and touch on some broader nature-climate connections and relevance in tropical seascapes, but of course anchored in coral reefs. And so I'll touch on a couple of different issues in the slides as I go along, and hopefully the narrative will become clear. I think in terms of the interactions of climate and biodiversity, the state that we're in now is a particularly worrying one that has been highlighted, I think, in the first presentation by Anna. We're facing a new step change in ocean temperatures. These are ocean temperatures from 1981 up to the present, to October this year. And there's a narrative here that's really important for us to get a grasp on. I've highlighted 2022 in the dark gray line. That was a relatively cool year for the last decade. But then what happened from January to March 2023, sea surface temperatures increased past the 2022 level, and then past the most recent, or the hottest year ever at that point, which was 2016. In June 2023, there was an unprecedented margin of about 0.3 of a degree Celsius above previous years. And this was maintained for 12 months. A new record was set every month for 15 months. And from July 2024 until now, temperatures have remained relatively close to what they were in 2023. It's instructive to look at the increments over the last year as comparable in magnitude to the increment to the 10 years before that, and then of about 30 years before that. So we're going through a real acceleration in temperatures now. This has been highlighted not just, I look at these graphs in relation to coral reefs, but looking at other parts of the global ocean and the climate interactions, the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. An open letter was just sent by climate scientists last month to the Nordic Council of Ministers, highlighting this issue of the crisis point in which we may be in terms of approaching tipping points beyond which, we don't quite know what's going to happen at that point in terms of acceleration. So every 1/10 of a degree counts in terms of limiting warming. For coral reefs, what we're seeing happening is this is a graph from the global status report of coral reefs from 2020 by the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network. In blue, you can see the cover of the proportion of coral cover from around 1980, just before that, up until 2019, which was when this report had the latest data, with some declines in coral cover that correspond to the black as the increase in sea surface temperatures as it progresses upwards in leaps and bounds, with in dark red are the bands where there was a rapid increase in sea surface temperature, and light red is sustained increases, and at a global level, a decrease in coral cover during those times. We're now preparing an update to that global status report for 2025. And so the question mark there is, after 2020, this is all just guesstimates. My hand drawing on this chart is we know that we are in 4th global coral bleaching event right now. Since mid-2023, when I first did this graph, we were a bit uncertain. How high has the temperature gone up in that time? And then what is the trend in coral cover globally? Did it recover since 2020 until 2023? And what is the amount of decline that is happening now? So this is the classic, the burning embers that Dan presented at the beginning from the IPCC for warm water corals. We're here, we're at the 1.5 degrees Celsius break point in the coming years. And what is going to be the impact on coral reefs as we progress towards 2 degrees? The challenge is that as we look more and more into climate vulnerability of global ecosystems, and our data improves and we see evidence of impacts, we're actually concerned that we've been underestimating the vulnerability of many ecosystems. This band from 1.5 to 2 degrees, or a critical band for coral reefs that the IPCC used in its 2022 report. Already in the Global Tipping Point report of 2023, a number of us brought this band down to 1 to 1.5 degrees. So we're about to approach the upper limit of that band now. And there's work in progress right now to push the lower boundary down to 0.7 degrees warming, which corresponds to 350 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So the criticality of the point that we're at for climate change is very important, and for impacts on biodiversity, as I think all are very well aware. New indicators coming out from coral reefs. This is the update to the red list of species of corals globally. The IUCN Coral Specialist Group has just put this out. It was released during COP29 just last week. And in this, we found that 44% of coral species, this is out of 890 coral species, which we could assess just under 780, 44% are threatened with extinction by the latest estimates. The percentage we had before in 2008 was 33%. We can't directly compare these numbers because the methodology has been improved in the last round, and we're now calculating the red list index to see what this real sort of increase in vulnerability is, to understand that better. We're investing a lot of effort in the red list of ecosystems as well, which is both of these are headline indicators under the global biodiversity framework now. So my team, we looked at the red list of ecosystems for West Indian Ocean coral reefs a few years ago, and we found that overall the region is vulnerable to collapse coral reefs, and at the eco-regional level shown there on the map, they vary from being vulnerable to critically endangered. The lower levels of vulnerability due to fishing pressure in the coming historically up until now, but all of the endangered and critically endangered ecoregions are because of future temperatures. And the red list of ecosystems has previously been implemented in the Caribbean at various scales, which I indicate down below. And those are all came up with vulnerable to critical status of reefs in those areas. So we know that coral reefs are at a critical point right now. I mean, the point is being made, which is very correct. There is a lot of variation in how corals respond to warming and to this pressure, and the degree of adaptation that may be possible, and acclimatization, and different species respond in different ways. But the overall threat to ecosystems is very large. And the perspective I want to put on that, looking forward, and this relates very well to the presentation we just heard from Turkey, from my colleague, and that is that we need to look at compounding threats to ecosystems. It's not just one thing or another. So on the upper right, this was an input to the workshop report, the joint workshop report between IPCC and IPBES in 2021. We looked at climate migration, and you could see that dark blue band is where species are moving out from towards the poles as their climate bands move. And then the various other colors show corridors or sinks or where species are moving to or through. The problem that I saw with this is that equatorial and climate migration is 5 times faster in the sea than it is on land. So as we begin to look at marine migration, and this is because of currents, and I guess the heat spreads faster perhaps in the sea. Equatorial marine communities are becoming depauperate due to climate migration. So species are moving poleward away from the equator. Because there's nowhere warmer, nothing is moving in. And we've just heard about how the Mediterranean is experiencing these invasions from the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean system. We've heard that a lot for the Caribbean as well. And while these are invasive species now that are threatening current ecosystems, these are actually maybe these will shift from being invasive to keystone species for future ecosystems and future marine habitats. They're really going to be the basis of marine biodiversity and economies in temperate latitudes in the coming years. But at the equator, we have no species replacement. We only have loss. At the same time, we have acidification, deoxygenation, there's increasing pollution and exploitation levels, and also increasing population and low governance levels. So we have a real crisis that is emerging in tropical and equatorial marine systems that we're really not looking at. Also in this paper on horizon issues, all these other compounding challenges affect tropical systems as well as others too. So wildfire and smoke impacts, coastal darkening from eutrophication and sedimentation, increasing toxicity of metal pollution due to ocean acidification, and then declining nutritional contents and availability of fish because of warming. So in terms of looking at the climate ocean interactions in equatorial regions, we really need to look into these and shift a lot of the focus, I think, of research. I'll just finish off with a bit of a perspective from IPBES, so coming out to a broader perspective and how to motivate for thinking more comprehensively about the changes that are coming. Now, this illustration in the middle, of course, is a sustainable development paradigm, nature, economy, and society. Now, in IPBES, we use this conceptual framework on the left to help organize our assessments. This took 2 or 3 years of consultation, completing in 2015. And really, we can map these boxes and arrows in IPBES's conceptual framework, which is hard to communicate outside of the science and assessment world. So from nature to nature's contributions to people and good quality of life and so on. But those labels do attach to the sustainable development sort of paradigm in the middle. So in our global assessment, we looked a lot at these direct uses on nature's contributions to people or ecosystem services. We identified 18 classes of them and whether they're trending upwards or downwards. We looked a lot and quantified direct drivers of biodiversity decline and passed those across terrestrial, freshwater, and marine systems. And they're the five main direct drivers there. What's important to look at in terms of how do we deal with current and future pressures is that those three contributions from nature that are increasing, those are the ones that are increasing because those are the ones that we maximize and optimize in our economic systems. So energy, food and feed, and materials such as wood and other things. We maximize their production, we externalize the costs of accessing them, and that externalization of costs leads to the direct drivers of decline in land and sea use change, from direct exploitation, climate change, and so on. Now the challenge with climate change becoming increasingly important, we're looking at nature-based solutions for those, which we need to use. But if we try and regulate climate and regulate ocean acidification, which are two of the NCP up there, if we try and use them in the same way as we've been maximizing output from other contributions from nature ecosystem service, we're only going to amplify impacts on the rest of nature as well. So we really need to shift our approaches to how we optimize our use of nature and the benefits that we get across much more complex systems than how we've done in the past. So my last slide, then, just finishing that. So now I come out into the more general space of not necessarily ocean all the time, but these principles apply to ocean and terrestrial ecosystems. Is how do we generate or find whole of society and whole of government approaches to find nature, climate / ocean solutions. Within IPBES, we produce assessments. We have 2 assessments coming out in December. I'll just flag these. And it turns out, this was not intentional really, but this is how it turns out, is that 1, the nexus assessment really looks at how food, water, and health sectors use biodiversity, interact with climate, and how do we get positive interactions amongst those rather than trade-offs. Our transformative change assessment looks at the underlying or root causes of how we interact with nature, our economic systems, the transformations and risks that we need to go through in order to improve our interactions. And then the 3 main messages I have over here are ones I presented at COP16 in a ministerial segment. And they're worth highlighting here just to emphasize that every 1/10 of a degree counts. Our need for integrated, balanced approaches to avoid exacerbating challenges and the necessity to address justice. And that with very high uncertainty, we need proportion. That's essential in moving forward to not magnify problems in the future, these issues of inter- and intra-generational justice. And I'll finish with that. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, David. That's a really, great overview of these many and urgent issues that we're experiencing at the moment. And a lot of questions come up to me at least. So perhaps I just invite guests and remind them to put their questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try and deal with them as best we can over the next 30 minutes. And so I guess to start, perhaps to start on you, David, actually, just to follow on from what you're saying. I think from your role with IPBES, like this is quite a significant year in that all the COPs are in the same year, and it's kind of a reminder that they are so connected in the way that they're operating. But I suppose from your experience, do you feel like these processes are getting closer together, or are people being reminded more often of these links that we've heard from everyone on the audience today, or do you think it needs a bit more, or perhaps a whole new way of doing things? Perhaps a big question.
Yeah, very big question. Well, I'll answer it briefly. I think we're all very well aware that these issues have to be brought together. The interlinkages are critical. And our nexus assessment and transformative change, I mean, they focus essentially on those. The CBD COP just had a decision on biodiversity and climate and came up with a very strongly worded decision to have much closer interaction between the 2 conferences of parties, between the CBD or the conventions and the UNFCCC. And I think that's very, very welcome. The sciences, of course, we study different aspects of the same system. So it's also, IPBES and IPCC had a joint workshop a few years ago. Certainly, from my understanding, we need to build these interlinkages as strongly as we can. Politically, the decisions are quite different for different sectors. So I'm not sure politically it helps to have the same overall decision-making process. We need to understand how we need to link all of these sectors together in order to optimize benefits, to balance all the benefits across the global system that we have.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's a it's a very complex related issues that I think a lot of people get frustrated by the speed at which these sort of processes occur related to the urgency of these issues that we're seeing from all these examples. Things are happening right now that are affecting people on the ground and these important ecosystems. It's, yeah, I don't know if anyone else would like to chip in on their thoughts on that, if you're closely related to these processes. Otherwise, I think perhaps this is a nice question for everyone to discuss, I think, because it touches on a few of them. I suppose it would be good to hear from your own experiences. Do people feel like we've reached a point where we have enough data and a deep enough understanding of all these systems and how their interconnections relate to other systems to be able to effectively conserve them? And particularly, I guess, do we know about these additive or synergistic, antagonistic kind of processes that are happening, or whether we're reaching tipping points? I think perhaps if I start with you, Ruth, perhaps because your system touches on so many of these aspects of these new issues that were unexpected and new knowledge.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's only more recently that in terms of the science that we're producing, we're also thinking about other impacts on the system. So not just the rats and those as an invasive species, but the habitat as well. So I do think we've still got quite a long way to go. And we're increasingly beginning to look at these connections within other systems as well. So we've got some collaborators who've been doing some work in mangroves in the Seychelles, looking at the influence of seabird nutrients on those systems. So I do think, yeah, that there's still so much more science to be done, but also that, and I think that the feedback that we're getting is that that's been well received by people who are wanting to put funding into things like the rat eradication programs. That, yeah, having more and more of this science, which is pointing in that direction, is a really, really good and useful thing. But yeah, I would also say that at the same time, we can see that the invasive species are really bad for these systems. So we should be forging ahead and kind of, yeah, focusing on island restoration as well currently too.
And perhaps over to Anna, and I know that there's a lot of uncertainty in these carbon links. How do you feel about the level of knowledge we have in these blue carbon systems, and how we can sort of use them for protecting the environment?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I think there is uncertainty for sure, but I think the science is coming along in leaps and bounds in the last sort of 5 years, and seeing what's happening on the ground, particularly awareness of projects going on and conversations with policy. I think we're very close. So I would like to think that we would be coming closer to having more effective conservation measures for these types of habitats within the next 5 years. Whether that's going to be fast enough or not is, to be found. But I think the issues about cumulative pressures that David was talking about on these systems and how to manage those beyond the conservation, those are much more hard to tackle. You have the marine space is so busy with human activity. It would be really hard to manage the impact of all those sectors on these types of connections that we have between different parts of the ocean ecosystem leading to carbon sequestration. So we need to have a much more holistic view about how we think about conservation in the ocean and the interrelations between these different sectors. But I guess the most important one, and why we're here today, the greatest sensitivity of these ecosystems is really to climate change. Kelp and seabed habitats are extremely sensitive to heat waves and long-term warming. And so if we don't tackle that first, we have a lot to lose, I think.
Yeah.
May I jump in on that, Dan?
Yeah.
I do think it's clear what directions, the trends and trajectories we're heading in, and we talk about this in the biodiversity space as in bending the curve of biodiversity decline and so on. We know that natural capital of biodiversity is being undermined. We know it's happening because of overuse and over-extraction. And we know that excess carbon dioxide emissions are driving climate change. So I think there are certain things we need to be making much stronger decisions on. We have plenty of knowledge to do that. And we also have a strong understanding of the proportion and the risks involved in in taking wrong decisions. I think we need a lot more understanding when it comes to details of interactions, for sure. But I think the global community does need to move much faster on relieving the pressures on biodiversity and the planet.
Yeah, and I guess that becomes equally a lot harder now that we're in this very rapidly changing environment. So things that we thought we knew about the environment previously are rapidly changing to a whole different paradigm now in this Anthropocene age. And so I guess perhaps that leads on to another question of, given what we've talked about today, given the knowledge we have, how do we best use this kind of knowledge from these various systems to work with communities to prepare for these changes, or to perhaps, think about how we might mitigate against them in a better way. Perhaps that's directed to start with Gizem, because you work so closely with the fisher communities in Turkey. Have you found this process is sort of easy, or has it been, have they been receptive to these ideas and changes?
It's a kind of a difficult question to answer. Actually, yes, that they are receptive, but it's not easy to work with the community with those challenges. Maybe I can give an example with the invasive species management that we do. For example, in 2015, when the fishers catch lionfish and see those species in their nets, they just throw away those species to the sea because they do not know they're edible. So that they are spending lots of fuel oil and lots of efforts, but they get nothing from their catch. So we started to visit all those cooperatives and small scale fisher communities to tell them those species are edible. And for the lionfish, the spines are the poisonous ones, and its meat is really healthy to eat. But it's not easy to encourage them to target those species. Still, we are doing some studies with the universities, like specialized fishing gear to target those lionfish. But it's sometimes being a challenge to persuade those fishers to use those fishing gears, because those fishing gears need to be repaired and it needs another cost. And when they also catch those fish, they do not find a buyer for those fish in the local community. So it's need to be taken into considered, like not only the fishing community, but also the consumers, also the restaurant chefs, and every other communities need to be in the same place and have to share the same understanding why it is important, why it is needed to be consumed. So I can say that we have to reach out all those audiences, not only the fishing community, not only the restaurant owners, but also the consumers, the universities, and the policymakers, and in all stakeholders need to be engaged in order to success for the management of the invasive species.
Thank you. And it's a great reminder that we often work in these silos of thinking that we just have to speak with one group and build up a capacity there, but it's so linked to all other areas around those areas we're working. And this idea of building knowledge and capacity around new systems or new ways of bringing in finance for new systems is a real challenge, for sure. Perhaps to pass over to you, Ruth. I know that the system you've touched on is specifically around oceanic atolls, but are these ideas sort of transferable to other communities, the coastal communities that have coral reefs? And can these kind of ideas be used to help amplify a kind of more positive action message for these very impacted systems?
Yeah, I would really hope so. I guess it's a bit difficult because of a lot of the research that we've done in terms of the scientific background underpinning these linkages has been done within places that there aren't currently human populations. And I think that is kind of something that's lacking in our research and is something that we're wanting to move away from, really, because obviously humans are such vital components of coral reef ecosystems as well. And one would hope that the fact that we are seeing higher reef fish biomass around places where there are seabird colonies might be something that local communities are also interested in. And there's also so much local knowledge in terms of fishers following seabird flocks and kind of, the linkages between humans as top predators and seabirds as top predators. But it hasn't been something that's been the focus of our research as of yet, and is definitely something that I think should be moving forward, particularly as we're expanding and beginning to look at other ecosystems like mangroves and other temperate systems as well. I think that, really considering the human interplay within those ecosystem dynamics is vital. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's such a powerful idea, but it's also quite nuanced, I guess, and perhaps balancing that against over nutrification in areas like the Caribbean versus these like nutrient poor areas in the Central Indian Ocean. It's a difficult one to balance, but powerful idea. And I guess following on that thread, and to you, David, I guess it fits quite well into these recent assessments of the red list of both corals and ecosystems, and they're often quite alarming images and ideas about the rate of increase in risk and decline in certain habitats. I mean, from your work perhaps with Cordio more, have you found certain actions are better received than others that bring sort of hope or a positive influence that people can act on, just from any of your sort of experience in the Western Indian Ocean?
So that's, it is actually a really difficult question in our region about what actions are most impactful or have high receptivity because of, I guess, high levels of poverty and dependence on reefs. So I think certainly we're finding that the more we can work on community-based approaches and give agency and empowerment for governments to give that back to communities to be in charge of their spaces. So if they conserve an area, then the fish in that area are protected from somebody else coming in and catching it and taking it, is critically important. And also that they see their interests are being held up in relation to others, such as tourism and developers who tend to come in with a lot more money. So the devolution, co-development, co-development of solutions and things like that are critical. I think really the main opportunities that we have to improve the condition for coral reefs is through expanding locally led approaches with communities and also local governments too.
Yeah, absolutely. And Anna, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I think this is such an important topic, if I might jump in as well. So in the UK, we've been doing work around trying to understand solutions for spatial management of marine habitats, but also natural resources, and how that can be done in a climate adaptive way. And I think the lessons we're learning here, building on projects we've done in other areas of the world, is really that it's so important to have this systems thinking about the decision making. So not just about systems thinking about the marine environment, but also about the human environment around it. And what we're finding is that the impacts of climate change are often very tangible to people in local communities and local government, but the solutions are intangible to them. It's very difficult to demonstrate their potential positive effects without translating that information into evidence that they can relate to. So doing work we've done, translating, for example, the potential benefits of having a climate adaptive protected area in a coastal region of Northern Ireland, for example, having associated with that beyond ecological benefits, having economic indicators that tell you potential effects on changes in the number of jobs in the coastal region, changes in the particular value of a given sector, the financial value of that sector, sorry, the economic value, are things that colleagues in local government, national government, in the industries understand, and that has a potential benefit of creating buy-in for those adaptive solutions. So it's about that translation of evidence and making sure that we understand what people in the regions actually care about, what are their priorities, and making sure that those solutions proposed are aligned with that is extremely important in how that information is received as well. So it's about having that understanding and knowing who are the key local actors, who are the gatekeepers. Sometimes that's the local community, sometimes that's local government, sometimes that's national government, and working with them in the delivery of that co-developed research. I think that's where the benefits are for us in terms of adapting, preparing for climate change.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. It's with all the work we do in fauna and flora, it's always working with local partners first as that key first step to make sure that you're working collectively with them to a solution. And I think it's a good reminder of like the ways that we need to act on both from local communities right up into government on these various stages, and these are often very hard to interact at all these different levels, particularly if you're new to this sort of world and just experiencing the pressures of it on a local scale. And perhaps that follows on actually to another question around this of bringing in nature finance. This quite often quite opaque or convoluted way in which we can bring in finance for these conservation measures. It links quite closely to what you've been talking about, Anna, on the carbon flows and the concept of carbon credits. There's definitely been more of a push to these high integrity carbon credits, which do incorporate these elements of equitable and just and high value credits that aren't just nominal. So I don't know how much you interact with those kind of mechanisms, or equally in the coral scene with blue bonds and these other sort of market mechanisms. But do you think we're at a level where people are getting more clarity on how these systems work, and perhaps on the scientific side, if we've got enough data to inform them? And I guess finally, if we're perhaps moving fast enough, these processes often take a long time to come to fruition, but people are experiencing pressures right now. So I don't know if you have opinions on these systems that you'd like to share with the group.
Yeah, as a natural scientist that works in this sort of area, I have my own personal feelings about it, but I think from a professional perspective, I think these are really important mechanisms that we have available to us. They have the potential to create a lot of good, but we know that they've not been always successful in the past, and there are issues of credibility around carbon credits and biodiversity credits. And my role has been to work with the private sector to try and create more robust scientific integrity within these systems, trying to make the scientific evidence more available to them and try to steer the process towards what we are most sure of, and try to steer it away from the areas which are still highly uncertain. I think it's a space that we can't ignore, however we might feel about it personally, because it is happening, it's growing very fast. So I do have sort of internal debates about the integrity of the process, but I think our role as scientists is to be part of it, to ensure that these processes are robust, that they deliver what they're going to they say that they want to deliver, and that they're working with natural communities and ecosystems in a way that's fair and just. So that's the role that I've had in the last few years. I work with sort of from very small actors that are looking to invest to those larger bodies that create the verification for these types of projects. And my personal request for all of us in scientific communities that we do engage, because when we don't, that's when we create a vacuum of knowledge and other actors come in which perhaps don't have the same sort of aims as we do in terms of conserving our natural world.
Thanks, Anna. And David, you have your hands up as well.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. If I can come in and respond a bit on what Anna said, because I agree 100%. I think, you know, the need to engage in this space is absolutely critical because the space is there. And if we don't do it, others certainly will. And the thing is, and what I'm trying to explore now with the IPBES framing and the nature's contributions to people, I showed the figure of the nature economy and society and the arrows connecting them. I mean, finance really was developed, or money was developed to quantify transactions, you know, between nature and economies and what people could save. And it's become this big, you know, this beast of its own, this huge capital that everybody is trying to build up. And we need to understand the systems model. Anna said that earlier as well. I think that's really important, so we have a full systems thinking. And and markets transact what we value. And if we just value making the most money, then carbon credits will only go to where they can make the most money, and they'll ignore the damage they do in other places. So you really need to understand how to develop these high integrity markets where they're not just making the most money, you're really restoring nature and you're providing benefits to people. And you're optimizing across all benefits from nature to people, not just carbon sequestration. And I think we're on the cusp of that, and we can get there, but it's going to take a lot more science and social science and economics and so on to really work out how that can work. So yeah, we need to be there, and we need to develop that as quickly as we can.
Thanks, David. And I think it's quite an optimistic perhaps end as we're coming up to the end of this talk. You know, I think the idea that we can use these systems and we need to build up that appreciation of how much value they give to people throughout the world is perhaps a good idea to finish on. Because often I think the framing of these debates is often quite negative and pessimistic about the state of things. But I think, personally, I think, you know, these examples that you've all highlighted today are really sort of exciting new bits of science that are showing, you know, we are gaining this better grasp of these systems, and that if we integrate that better with local communities on the ground and ideas at the higher level to link them together a bit closer, we might be in a better state of affairs in the future. And so perhaps just in this final minute, just to say a massive thank you once again to all of you for your time and for your thoughts. It's really appreciated, and I think it's been super interesting. A reminder that this talk has been recorded, and so please share with any colleagues that might be interested. And so, yeah, thanks once again, and Katie, pass back to you.